just revealed to our host, the secret of a lecture of an architect. And there's one key secret, is that whether the topic is sustainability, or whether the topic is modern financing in real estate, or whether the topic is mobility, eventually either architect will talk about his or her own work. So, since you know the secret right now, and I immediately tell everything you ought to know, I'll start with something else. I will present to you a story, a threefold story, with a small prologue, let's say a main part, and a small epilogue. And the story is indeed about our own work, but at the same time, I would like to address the notion of perspective. And I would like to address the notion of perspective related to mobility. And hence, although it's not my own work, the work of our office, still, let's say, the lecture has this kind of poetic title called The Voyage and the Map. Since talking about mobility or talking about movement, and especially talking about movement of people through space or through society or through their career, you always should, let's say, delineate an idea of a map, or you should delineate an idea how you can understand this movement and how you can perceive this movement. And the way to understand this movement is by defining a map of your own world, a map of your own career, a map of society. And in architecture, since I'm an architect, we always consider ourselves the center of the universe. And we didn't, let's say, develop that much since the Ptolemaic view on the world. And essentially, if you would like to understand movement, and if you would like to understand labor mobility or movement through space, you should be aware of the fact that although we know that Earth isn't the center of the universe, although we know that apparently, let's say, the universe is something quite different, eventually we will always act as if we are the center of the universe. And it's very, let's say, important to realize that, whether you're in a European cultural setting or whether you're in a non-European cultural setting, eventually, in order to understand perspectives on movement or on mobility, your main viewpoint always starts here. And your main viewpoint always starts with perceiving the world, let's say, looking around you, understanding the world from your own perspective. And as soon as you're aware of that, and as soon as you're aware of that although we've moved along since the Ptolemaic view on the world, we should understand that mobility is a twofold, let's say, question. Understanding what kind of perspective you have while moving through space, moving through a country, moving through a map, traveling from stage to stage, and what kind of cultural denomination or cultural elements you integrate in that question. So, as I already said, let's say architects can only talk about their own work. Let's say, starting from this cultural notion and starting with the notion of perspective and defining your life or movement as a definition of a map, and a definition of a map based on a personal, let's say, fascination, or based on personal experiences, I would like to discuss work of our office, and I would like to discuss the work of our office through the lens of mobility, or through the lens of movement. And eventually, movement is something, let's say, harsh, something difficult, something tough, something tangible that really, let's say, works in either aspect of your body. This picture, although rather abstract, will, let's say, or tries to convey to you an idea that is key in order to understand our architecture. Of course, let's say architecture in general, architecture shouldn't move. Let's say the essence of architecture is that it doesn't move. Whenever you have experienced, for instance, an earthquake or a heavy earthquake, let's say one of the fundamental anxieties of people is that as soon as buildings start to move, let's say, it really changes your perspective on life. So we make inert, solid buildings that remain grounded forever, not for 20 years, but hopefully, as either architect would claim, forever. So this picture tries to convey the idea that as a tension or as a counterpoint to this inertia of the built substance, the inertia of this built volume, the movement of people through space, let's say this changing perspective of this Ptolemaic-oriented person through this space is key, or let's say essential, to understand your building, but also to understand the way we design. I selected, and of course in that sense it wasn't a coincidence that Rens just referred to it, I selected 2 buildings out of these, 16 buildings or something. I selected 2 buildings that in a way comprise 2 different approaches towards movement or towards mobility. And in essence, the one building, the first building, I will try to explain to you, let's say all movement or all mobility in the building is conceived from the heart of the volume. So in order to understand the building and also in order to understand, again, this kind of Ptolemaic artistic view on life, everything starts from the heart of this volume. Everything is to be understood from the heart of the volume. That's for you the picture on the left-hand side, Institute for Sound and Vision. The other drawing tries to convey an idea about moving through the periphery of a volume, or let's say moving across the borders or along the borders of an assignment. So in order to understand, let's say, these 2 different polar approaches towards mobility or towards understanding a topic, you could, let's say, start in the heart of it and extend your knowledge of a certain idea or a certain building, in this case, from the heart of the topic, or you can understand, let's say, the topic or the building at hand, in this case, by moving through the periphery and understanding the periphery of the building. So this polarity is, in order to, let's say, get back to the issue of the afternoon, I think of utmost importance also to understand labor mobility. Whereas if you, let's say, transfer from the Netherlands to another place in the world, let's say you could always, let's say, remain in the periphery of a culture, or you should kind of dare to step in and to understand a culture or a future professional setting from the heart of it, or from the center of it. So I will briefly try to convey to you, let's say, the organization of the Institute of Sound and Vision in Hilversum. Hilversum is a small town near Amsterdam, and we designed, in Hilversum, we designed National Institute for Sound and Vision. This institute comprises all archives related to audiovisual industry since the invention of the media. So whatever has been broadcasted either on radio or on television or on non-fiction cinema is stored here. So the building contains a gigantic archive. It contains a museum in order to convey elements from the archive and to show it to the larger audience, but it also contains a kind of professional part where you can buy seconds. For instance, when a Dutch prince would die, or when there's a national anniversary, the news reels on television buy their seconds there in order to have, let's say, the Queen on the horse, or a famous soccer player making his final winning goal, and it's stored there. Hence, the building is conceived out of 5 different elements. So the colored blocks represent the programmatic defined parts, and the non-colored block, the transparent colored block, is in fact the center, the heart of this institute that binds all these different programmatic entities together. So in the heart of the building, as we already stated, as a kind of opening statement of my lecture, in order to understand the building, you should, let's say, understand the heart of this institute. Hence, in the heart of the building, there's a kind of large open space that binds together these 4 different programmatic entities of the building. The building is subterraneous for half of it, and since the building is subterraneous, you enter through a bridge, over a bridge, a large entrance bridge in the building. And at the same time, as you can see, from either, let's say, from either level in the building, you can perceive all different other programmatic entities in the building. So the building is composed out of these 4 distinct elements: the archive, gigantic archive, the museum hovering above you, and a large office part where, let's say, everything that relates to this archive is being organized and being handled. As I already claimed, in order to understand mobility, but also in order to understand this design, after entering over this bridge into the heart of the building, you can directly enter into the museum, you can directly enter into the office building, you can directly enter into the subterraneous archives, or you can go to this space, for instance, where they sell these seconds. So talking about mobility, or talking about architecture in general, is by taking a position vis-a-vis this assignment, of course, but also trying to understand in advance whether you would like to convey an idea in such a way that the building is to be understood from the heart, in this case, where, let's say, of course, either element of the building remains stable and remains inert, unmoved, and that people, let's say, move from this center through the building. And you, of course, from that element, you can enter into the museum, a large museum. I won't explain that to you. Or you can enter the restaurant just shown. And eventually, of course, you always return here into the heart. You could go to the restaurant down there, or you could cross the bridge again and leave the building. Eventually, this is the last thing I would like to briefly show you about this building, is that the building is also to be understood as an image in the modern avalanche of images. And related to the famous picture of Willem van Haagt, the cabinet of Dr. van der Geest, we tried to conceive images in the building that are to be understood as moving images, as a kind of colored ghosts that are integrated in the glass of the facade. And although, since I'm always way too slow in my speeches, and I'm trying to speed up, and I always think, I only have 20 minutes and I only have 7 minutes left, so I'll skip a lot. But the thing is, why I still would like to show you this, is the fact that movement or mobility is also to be conceived as a kind of changing, let's say, notion of time, a changing notion of your position on the map, also a changing notion in time. And what we did in this building, since it's the Institute of Sound and Vision, you don't have a Mona Lisa. You only have, let's say, elements in your collection that are to be understood when it's displayed on the screen, or when you hear the sound while played in the, let's say, in the computer. And as soon as the sound stops, there's nothing left, as you know. Yeah? When the music stops, music disappears. So we thought that we should make something, or we should convey an idea of mobility, or of, let's say, changing nature, by casting these colored images in glass. And as you can understand, since the sun moves, you remain on one position on the earth, but the sun still moves 24 hours a day, and then the color of the main spaces change due to the fact that the sun is turning. The color of the colored glass reflects in the image, and eventually mobility is to be understood as a kind of permanent transformation of the world around you. Briefly, I'll explain you a museum we just, let's say not just, we realized a year ago, or which opened a year ago, precisely a year ago, in Antwerp. And the museum is to be understood as kind of gigantic stacking of large boxes. Boxes containing everything a city collects over hundreds of years. It has an incredible collection of tangible pieces, opposed to the Institute of Sound and Vision, where everything is ephemeral and untangible. In this case, everything is tangible. They have beautiful Rubens paintings, beautiful Rogier van der Weijden paintings, and also trash. Literally, I shouldn't say that, but let's say mundane elements of everyday life. To rephrase my previous words. The idea of these boxes is that either box contains parts of this, it's a stacking of boxes, contains, let's say, part of this collection, and there's a gigantic escalator route going up from grade to the top of the building, and it spirals around these boxes, and it spirals over these boxes. And this route is glazed. So in contrast to the Institute of Sound and Vision, let's say, in this case, mobility, let's say, is essentially organized in the periphery of the volume, and is essentially to be understood as a large staircase winding up a 60-meter high museum tower, and eventually ending on a roof platform. So, talking about mobility and talking about, let's say, moving your body through space. In this case, due to a lot of escalators, you kind of elegantly move up to the top. But in this case, mobility is directly to be understood vis-a-vis the relation with the surrounding urban fabric. So if you understand, if you're in grade, if you're downstairs in this building, you only see, let's say, the buildings in a direct vicinity. And if you move up, eventually you have this kind of gigantic, overwhelming view over the city. So, talking about labor mobility, or talking about mobility through architecture or in architecture, let's say, mobility always offers you the possibility of distancing yourself and, let's say, relating yourself with the surrounding map, or relating yourself with the surrounding city, and kind of offering yourself new viewpoints that were never there before. And eventually, like every architect, I will proudly present you the interior of this building, and of course, I don't show you mundane elements of everyday life, nor beautiful Rogier van der Weijden paintings. I will only like to express the kind of sturdy, solid, inert character of architecture. Eventually, either building relates to its surroundings. Eventually, either design should relate to the context, to its natural or cultural context, and to its direct physical context. As I already stated in my opening statement, let's say, understanding your position on the map in the world is also understanding the position of a building in a cultural sense or in a physical sense. In this case, if you move up through this building, you have a let's say, beautiful view on the square. The square contains a large painting, or not necessarily painting, I don't know the English word actually, a mosaic by a painter called Luc Tuymans. And Luc Tuymans paid a tribute to Quentin Matsijs. Quentin Matsijs, who is the author of this beautiful early Flemish school painting. Quentin Matsijs was the founding father of the Flemish school. But Quentin Matsijs was a highly controversial person in Antwerp. He was that controversial since he was homosexual that he was not allowed to be buried in the cathedral of the city. Eventually, Luc Tuymans, very well-known contemporary painter, used or based a new painting on, let's say, the dark mask of Quentin Matsijs as a tribute to Quentin Matsijs. And this painting is eventually part of the square design of our tower in Antwerp. So if you go up through this passage of escalators, eventually if you're on the 8th floor, you have a splendid view on this painting. And the drawing is not upside down, because you have to imagine that you change your perspective and you look from the tower back on this square, and eventually you will see this. So if you would like to understand architecture, but if you would like to understand movement through space, you should always be aware of the notion of perspective and the notion of where you are in life and where you're going in life. I'm almost finished. As I started with my opening play, but defining your position on the map and understanding your position in the world by moving through the world, moving either through the periphery of a building or through the heart of the building, eventually this is all, let's say, a matter of perspective. And architecture, since it's not a free art, we always work, let's say, assigned by somebody else, you should always try to understand what perspective is articulated. And that also counts for mobility. If you would like to understand people moving through time, moving through their career, moving through space, you always should understand. This is a very, very intriguing painting. Since it's called the marriage of Mr. Arnolfini and his wife, made by Jan van Eyck in 1432, and it offers a splendid view on perspective, since in the heart of the painting, there's the painter himself, conveying at least two ideas. That although we see Mr. and Mrs. Arnolfini, we should be aware of the fact that we always see ourselves. Thank you very much for your attention.
A few questions for you, because I loved your presentation, and where can we see this painting? Do you know?
National Gallery in London.
All right, that's worth a trip.
Yeah.
Well, from an architectural point of view, because you make beautiful buildings, and as I said earlier, I was yesterday at the Sound and Vision, and although it's a big building, you feel comfortable in that building. And what I was wondering about is, how do you know from scratch when you're drawing at your table or your computer? I don't know how you do that. How do you know if people feel themselves comfortable in what you are designing at that moment?
You make an estimated guess, of course.
Mm-hmm.
But the only way to understand it is to change your perspective and to understand what you can see and what I can see, and whether I, let's say, are able to, let's say, translate or transcend my own position in such a way that I can understand what you would like to see or what you would like to experience while visiting a building.
But how do you do that? Do you really literally crawl into your drawing, or what do you
No,
do?
no, what we do in order to test our buildings, we also draw scenarios. And that's an incredible, fascinating tool, in fact. So, for instance, for the Institute of Sound and Vision, we presented our client, let's say, 5 different scenarios, conveying the idea of a party, conveying the idea of a, I don't know, royal wedding, conveying the idea of, I don't know, a Dutch team winning the European soccer championship.
Darn, why do you have to mention that?
And either, let's say, either scenario would demand different, let's say, organization in space, or would demand, let's say, a different perspective in space. And if all these scenarios, in a way, will fit or can fit in this building, in this design, this test or this, we believe that by testing it in such a way, eventually the building will work.
All right, right. And because you have to be, when I look at your presentation, you have to be half a psychologist to know what people do in certain situations. Do you know how to steer people? Because you had a route through the Antwerp building and a route through the Hilversum building, and that's what normal people will do, or something like that. How do you steer people in a building? How do you let them move the way you want them to move? You want them to move.
No, stop.
You don't do that.
No, we're not
Really?
designing IKEAs. In IKEA, you first have to, let's say, pass the cupboards, and then you have to pass the linen.
You don't do that.
No. I really think it's preposterous that you would claim that you designed IKEA. So, but there's of course, let's say that's the second layer of your argument is indeed that you do have to steer people. But at the other hand, you should, let's say, provide liberty, and you should always provide options, or you should provide scenarios, different scenarios.
That's what's missing in IKEA. Options.
Yeah, there are no scenarios.
Yeah, that's terrible.
So, in that sense, yes, we do steer people, but we offer them, let's say, always an escape. You can go by escalator, or by stair, or by elevator. You can take the slow route, or you can take the direct route through an elevator. So by offering all these different scenarios again, you liberate yourself from the IKEA, and at the same time you do, let's say, design it in such a way that the elevator is not directly visible, hence people take the stair, etc. So there are some tricks.
There are some tricks of the master. Yes. Ladies and gentlemen, give him an applause. Michiel Riedijk.